I've got a question for you about wormholes. You may have heard that if you were to travel through one, you could go back in time. And if that's true, there's a problem. I call it the Great Filter Bank Paradox, and here's why. First, let me say I'm not convinced that time travel is possible. But physicists like Sean Carroll say it should be possible because the mathematics of general relativity allows for it. So, just for the sake of argument, let's assume that wormholes do allow you to travel back in time. What could possibly go wrong? Well, suppose you get in your rocket ship and blast off to a nearby star system, perhaps Proxima Centauri, which is only 4 light years away from us. It's the closest star system to ours. On the way, you fire up your particle accelerator, turn on the thrusters, and zoom through a wormhole that happens to be close by. When you come out the other end of the wormhole, you find yourself 10 light years further away. But something's not right. You traveled 10 light years. But how could that be when you only left our solar system? How can we reconcile these two observations? You realize that you must have traveled back in time too before you left our solar system. But there's a problem. Suppose you decide to travel back in time by 30 years. When you get out of the wormhole, you are indeed back in Earth's orbit, but it's 30 years earlier than when you left. No big deal, right? Except that you know that you will never have existed for those 30 years. You didn't exist before you went on your trip. How does this work exactly? Let us say you left Earth at age 20 and then you traveled back in time 30 years to when you were born. At what age did you arrive back on Earth? Well, you would have arrived at age 0. This would mean that you were born twice. And while some people claim that this is possible under certain circumstances, I think that this is clearly impossible. So you must have traveled back in time less than 30 years, but how much less? Let's say you traveled back in time 29 years. That means that you would have been born on Earth when you were still 1 year old. That doesn't make any sense either. Or you could have traveled back in time 28 years, in which case you would have been born when you were still 2 years old. Or generally, if you traveled back in time on years whereon is less than 30, you would have been born when you were still on years old, which also doesn't make any sense. It seems that you can never travel back in time far enough so that you are born. So it seems that you can never travel back in time far enough so that you can meet your parents. In fact, you can never travel back far enough so that you can meet any human who currently exists. What's going on here? Is there some law of physics that prevents you from traveling back in time far enough to meet any existing humans? Actually, no, there is no such law of physics. All you need to do is go back far enough in time to meet someone who is related to you, but not too far. Let's say that you have a half-sister. She has one parent who is your father, but she has a different mother. Now, suppose that you travel back in time to before your sister was born, but after your father was born. Then you would have existed for some period of time before you met your father. Since you had a half-sister who shared a parent with you, you would have existed for some period of time before you met your half-sister. But since you would have no knowledge of your half-sister or your father, when you went back in time, you wouldn't know that you had ever met them before. So this works, but there's a problem. After all, you have a half-sister only because your father had an affair with another woman. He wasn't unfaithful to your mother, otherwise you wouldn't have been born in the first place. So if you prevent your sister from being born, then your father won't have an affair with that other woman, which means that you were never born. This creates a paradox. You can't travel back in time far enough so that you can meet anyone who currently exists unless you create a paradox. This is what I call the Great Filter Bank Paradox because it is as though there is some great filter preventing you from going back in time far enough to meet anyone who currently exists. But wait a minute. Your father had affairs before he met your mother, right? Maybe you can go back in time far enough so that you can meet one of your half-siblings who is older than you. And indeed you can, but that creates its own problems. Let's say you have a half-sibling who is 10 years older than you. If you go back in time to before they were born, then you will have existed for 10 years before you meet them. When you go back in time, you won't know that you've already met them before. But once you meet them, you know that they're 10 years older than you. Therefore, you know that you've traveled back in time by at least 10 years. This means that you can never go back in time so that you can meet any human younger than you, unless you create a paradox. But wait a minute, you can go back in time to before your parents were born, right? Indeed you can, but then you would have no parents. So you couldn't have been born. This is a bit of a paradox. What if you travel back in time to a few million years ago and you meet a human ancestor? Does that count? I say no, it doesn't count because if you're not careful, you can create a paradox. For example, suppose you take some dirt with you from the future. You go back in time and you dump the dirt on the ground. You didn't do anything to change the past, right? Well, yes, you did, because that dirt contains bacteria that doesn't exist naturally in that time period. This changes the future, which means that you can never travel back in time so that you can meet any human ancestor unless you create a paradox. Okay, I get it. This is a very complicated topic. Can't we just agree to disagree? No, because there's a simple explanation for all this. When you go back in time, you don't really exist. Wait, what? Let me explain. You see, if you go back in time too before you were born, you can't interact with anyone, including yourself. This means that you don't really exist. Instead, you might say that you exist on the outside, but on the inside you are really dead. Think about it this way. Suppose you are currently standing next to a wall and I ask you, do you exist? Well, yeah, I guess so, but then I say, what are you doing right now? And you might say, I'm standing next to a wall. And I say, well, actually you're not doing anything. You're completely still. Are you really an existing being? Well, maybe not. An observer might conclude that you exist because you are visible, but really, you're just a zombie. If you travel back in time to before you were born, you would be like this zombie, except instead of being next to a wall, you would be in a wormhole. If you aren't doing anything, then you don't really exist. But the thing is, if you go back in time too, before you were born, how do you know that you aren't already dead? Perhaps you always were a zombie. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that time travel isn't possible, but it does mean that if you want to go back in time and meet your parents, you're going to have to do better than that. By the way, if you want to learn more about wormholes, I've got a course all about them over at brilliant.org. Brilliant is my favorite way to learn something new because they make learning really fun. They've got thousands of lessons ranging from astrophysics to economics to programming. The course that I've got for you is called Wormholes, Black Holes, and Time Travel. The lessons are short and engaging, and at the end of the course, you can even simulate your own wormhole. Thanks for watching.